What happens when a trusted professional abuses their power? Enter Dr. Stephen R. Henson, a man who, for many years, wore the respected title of a doctor in Wichita. He was a professional relied upon by his patients, a pillar of the medical community. But beneath the facade of his white coat and stethoscope, a darker narrative was unfolding. Dr. Henson, a man of 63 years, found himself facing charges that sent shockwaves through the community. The United States Department of Justice accused him of selling opioid prescriptions to customers without any legitimate medical need. These weren't just any medications, mind you. We're talking about powerful painkillers, substances that have the potential to wreak havoc on the lives of those who misuse them. His actions weren't just unethical, they were illegal. And they weren't just illegal, they were dangerous. It was a betrayal of trust, a misuse of power that turned a highly regarded healthcare provider into a drug dealer in a white coat. Dr. Henson's charges were extensive and severe. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy to dispense, distribute, and possess, with the intent to distribute controlled substances. He also faced 8 counts of dispensing and aiding and abetting with possession, with intent to distribute controlled substances, 5 counts of dispensing controlled substances, and 6 counts of money laundering. And if that wasn't enough, a jury had previously convicted Dr. Henson on 1 count each of making a false writing and attempting to obstruct a court order. This was a man who was supposed to heal, to care, to alleviate pain. Instead, he fueled addiction, exploited vulnerability, and violated the very oath that defines his profession. So, what happens when a trusted professional abuses their power? In the case of Dr. Stephen R. Henson, the answer is a decade-long prison sentence. This is the story of how a doctor's misuse of his professional power led to a decade-long prison sentence. The list of charges was long and serious. So let's delve into the specifics. Stephen R. Henson, the once trusted Wichita doctor, pleaded guilty to a litany of charges, each one more grave than the last. Let's start at the beginning. The first 2 counts of the charges were of conspiracy to dispense, distribute, and possess with intent to distribute controlled substances. In layman's terms, this means that Henson was accused of not only dispensing and distributing these substances, but also of conspiring to do so. A conspiracy charge suggests a level of premeditation and planning that adds a layer of severity to the crime. Following this, Henson faced 8 counts of dispensing and aiding and abetting with possession with intent to distribute controlled substances. This implies that he wasn't acting alone. He allegedly had accomplices whom he aided in the distribution of these substances. Next on the list were 5 counts of dispensing controlled substances. This means that he was accused of giving out prescription drugs without a legitimate medical reason, completely disregarding the potential risks to the patient's health and well-being. But the charges didn't stop there. Henson was also accused of 6 counts of money laundering. This suggests that he was not only distributing these substances unlawfully, but also profiting from it and then attempting to hide the origin of these ill-gotten gains. Finally, the court documents revealed that a jury had previously convicted Henson on 1 count, each of making a false writing and attempting to obstruct a court order. These charges concerned drug offenses, adding to the portrait of a man who had seemingly lost his way. All these charges culminated in a grim narrative, a trusted professional morphing into a key player in the opioid crisis, allegedly putting profits before patients, and violating the very essence of the Hippocratic Oath he had once sworn to uphold. The court documents painted a picture of a doctor who had strayed far from his Hippocratic Oath. Henson was initially sentenced to life in prison, but he wouldn't accept this without a fight. Convicted for unlawfully distributing prescription drugs, the former Wichita doctor, Stephen R. Henson, found himself facing a life sentence. This was a severe punishment that reflected the gravity of his offenses, but Henson, unwilling to spend his entire life behind bars, decided to appeal the sentence. His appeal was a complex legal process, one in which he sought to challenge the severity of his initial sentencing. It was a calculated move, a strategic play in the complex game of the justice system, where the stakes were high and the consequences far-reaching. The appeal process was a lengthy one, stretching over months of legal wrangling and negotiations. Henson's legal team put forth their arguments, emphasizing the doctor's age and the potential for rehabilitation. They argued that a life sentence was too harsh for a man of 63 and that the punishment should fit the crime. While the appeal was in progress, Henson reached a plea agreement with the federal government. This agreement, a compromise of sorts, would ultimately lead to a significant reduction in his sentence. Instead of life in prison, Henson would now spend about a decade behind bars. The plea agreement was a turning point in Henson's case. It acknowledged his guilt while also providing a way out of the life sentence that initially loomed over him. It was a deal that saw him pleading guilty to a multitude of charges, including conspiracy to dispense, distribute, and possess, with intent to distribute controlled substances, dispensing and aiding and abetting with possession with intent to distribute controlled substances, dispensing controlled substances, and money laundering. The plea agreement culminated in Henson's sentencing on a Friday. The former doctor, once a trusted professional, was sentenced to 120 months in federal prison. It was a stark contrast to his initial life sentence and a testament to the power of appeals and plea agreements in the justice system. The appeal and plea agreement may have reduced his sentence, but they couldn't erase the damage done. Behind every crime, there are victims. In this case, one of them was Nick McGovern. Nick McGovern wasn't a statistic or a faceless name on a prescription. He was a living, breathing individual with dreams and aspirations, with a family who loved him. His life was abruptly cut short when he succumbed to an overdose from drugs prescribed by Stephen R. Henson. Henson, a man who was sworn to do no harm, instead became the dealer of death, a man whose reckless prescription practices ended lives instead of saving them, and one of those lives was that of Nick McGovern. Nick's story is not unique, as our country faces an opioid crisis, but it's a stark reminder of the human cost of this epidemic. The drugs that ended Nick's life were not obtained illegally from a back alley dealer. They were handed over in a small bottle from a trusted professional, a doctor who was supposed to heal, not harm, but harm he did. Nick's family was left to grapple with the sudden loss, a hole in their lives that can never be filled. Their son, brother, friend was gone, and in his place was a void filled with grief, anger, and a burning question. Why? Why did a man who took an oath to protect and heal become the harbinger of their worst nightmare? Nick's community was also shaken by his untimely death. A life full of promise, snuffed out too soon. Friends left to mourn, schools and workplaces left with an empty chair. A grim reminder of the lethal dance between addiction and unscrupulous prescription practices. And let's not forget the ripple effect of such a tragedy. Every person Nick knew, every life he touched, was affected by his loss. His death became a stark, horrifying illustration of the deadly consequences of Henson's actions. But let's remember Nick for who he was, not how he died. A son, a brother, a friend. A victim of a crime perpetrated not in a dark alley, but in the sterile white offices of a trusted professional. A life cut short by the very person who was supposed to protect it. Nick McGovern's life was cut short, a tragic result of Henson's reckless prescription practices. Between July 2014 and August 2015, Henson ran a pill mill out of his clinic in Wichita. This was a time when the clinic's doors were open not for the sick, but for those seeking a quick fix for their addiction. It was a time when the Hippocratic Oath seemed to have been forgotten, replaced by a darker, more sinister motive. During this period, Henson would entertain what he called illegitimate pain patients, individuals who had no real need for powerful painkillers, but sought them out nonetheless. These were not your typical patients, and their appointments were far from typical as well. They were held during non-business hours, when the clinic was devoid of any other staff. These secretive meetings had but one objective: the exchange of prescriptions for cash. Imagine walking into a doctor's office, not for a checkup or because you're ill, but because you know the doctor will give you exactly what you want, no questions asked. You tell him which drugs you want, and he scribbles them down on a prescription pad, taking your cash in exchange. There's no examination, no inquiry into your medical history, no attempt to determine whether you actually need the medication. It's a transaction as simple as buying groceries, but with far graver consequences. Henson was known to prescribe the most potent versions of these drugs, often in large quantities. He would prescribe oxycodone, methadone, and alprazolam, drugs known for their addictive properties and potential for abuse. And these prescriptions weren't just for a handful of pills. No, they were for large quantities, the kind that could last a user for weeks, if not months. But this wasn't a pharmacy, and Henson wasn't just a pharmacist. He was a doctor, a person who had sworn to do no harm. Yet he chose profits over patients, addiction over assistance. His clinic became a hub for the illegal distribution of drugs, a place where addiction was not just enabled, but actively promoted. Henson's clinic was not a place of healing, but a hub for illegal drug distribution. It was a place where the sacred trust between a doctor and patient was broken, where the sanctity of medicine was replaced by the ugliness of greed and addiction. And for the people who walked through its doors, it was a place that offered not relief, but a deeper descent into the clutches of addiction. The case of Dr. Stephen R. Henson is a cautionary tale. A tale that underlines the devastating ripple effects of the opioid crisis and the vital role of professionals like Henson. The reverberations of such actions not only disrupt the lives of individuals, but also the fabric of our society. The opioid crisis has become a public health catastrophe, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands over the years. It's a crisis that doesn't discriminate, indiscriminately impacting communities across the country. But it's not just about the numbers. Behind each statistic is a human life, a story cut short, a family forever changed. Actions like those of Dr. Henson exacerbate this crisis. Professionals in the medical field who should act as gatekeepers instead become enablers when they misuse their authority. It's a stark reminder that the white coat does not make one infallible, and that the power to prescribe can be as destructive as it is healing. This case underscores the importance of ethical conduct in the medical profession. Doctors are entrusted with the health of their patients, a responsibility that must never be taken lightly. Their decisions can be the difference between life and death, recovery or dependence, hope or despair. This trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, casting a long shadow over the profession. It's a call to action for stronger regulations, more stringent oversight, and better education about the risks and responsibilities of prescribing opioids. It's a plea for empathy and understanding for those struggling with addiction, and for the recognition that they are not just numbers, but people longing for help. This story is, unfortunately, not unique. It's a grim chapter in the narrative of the opioid crisis, a narrative that we must strive to change. We need to foster an environment where trust and ethical conduct are paramount, where doctors are part of the solution, not the problem. May this serve as a reminder of the harm that can come when trust is betrayed and power is abused. It's a reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must continue to fight this crisis, and that we must always put the health and well-being of people first.